21 Mother Bear knocked on door, begging to adopt abandoned baby. What family did next put everyone in tears. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, covering the small cabin in a blanket of white so thick that the world beyond seemed to have disappeared entirely. Ethan Marshall stood by the window, watching the flakes drift down in the fading light of evening, each one catching the warm glow from inside before vanishing into the growing darkness. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace behind him, sending shadows dancing across the wooden walls that his grandfather had built with his own hands 60 years ago. Lily Morgan was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared their evening meal, the smell of fresh bread and vegetable soup filling the air with a comfort that seemed to push back against the cold pressing in from outside. They had chosen this life, far from the noise and rush of the city, in a place where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away through dense forest, and the only sounds at night were the wind through the pines and the occasional call of an owl. The knock came just as Ethan was turning away from the window, soft at first, so gentle that he thought it might have been a branch blown against the door by the wind. But then it came again. 3 deliberate taps that had a strange rhythm to them, almost like someone was being careful not to knock too hard. Lily looked up from the stove, her eyes meeting his across the room with the same question he was thinking. Who could possibly be out here in this weather, at this hour, when the nearest road was buried under 4 feet of snow? Ethan moved toward the door, his hand reaching for the heavy flashlight they kept on the shelf beside it, while Lily turned down the heat on the stove and followed him, wiping her hands on her apron. The knocking came again, this time followed by a sound that made them both freeze, a low, rumbling noise that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't human either. Through the small window beside the door, Ethan could see nothing but darkness and swirling snow at first. He clicked on the porch light, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Standing on their wooden porch, covered in snow and ice, was a massive brown bear. But this wasn't the aggressive stance of a bear looking for food or defending territory. The animal was sitting, almost like a dog might sit, and its eyes, catching the light from the porch, held something that Ethan had never seen in a wild animal before. It was looking directly at him, not with the blank stare of an animal, but with what seemed like purpose, like intention. The bear lifted one massive paw and knocked again, 3 gentle taps that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Lily grabbed his arm, her fingers tight with fear, but there was something else in her voice when she whispered. She pointed down, and that's when they both saw it. There on the porch, partially hidden by the bear's bulk, was a bundle wrapped in what looked like an old quilt. The bear moved slightly, just enough to give them a better view, and they could see it clearly now. It was moving, the bundle was moving, and from within came a sound that cut through the wind and snow like nothing else could. It was the cry of a baby, thin and weak, but unmistakably human. The bear looked down at the bundle, then back up at them, and made a sound that was almost like a whimper, pushing the bundle gently with her nose toward the door. The impossibility of the situation should have paralyzed them, should have sent them running for the phone to call for help. But something about the bear's posture, about the way she was looking at them, made Ethan's hand move to the door handle. Lily didn't try to stop him, though her grip on his arm tightened. He opened the door just a crack, ready to slam it shut if the bear made any aggressive move, but the animal just sat there, snow gathering on her fur, those intelligent eyes never leaving his face. The baby's cry came again, weaker this time, and the bear made another soft sound, almost like she was trying to speak, trying to communicate something urgent and important. Ethan opened the door wider, and the cold rushed in like a living thing, but he barely noticed it. The bear stood up slowly, carefully, and backed away from the bundle, moving to the edge of the porch. She sat down again, watching waiting. It was clear what she wanted, as impossible as it seemed. She wanted them to take the baby. Lily was the first to move, pushing past Ethan and dropping to her knees beside the bundle. Her hands were shaking as she pulled back the edge of the quilt, and there, red-faced from crying and cold but very much alive, was an infant. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in layers of cloth beneath the quilt, with a small knitted cap on its head. Lily scooped up the bundle and stood, backing toward the door, and the bear made no move to stop her, just watched with those strange, knowing eyes. Once they were inside with the door closed, the surreal nature of what had just happened hit them both at once. Lily was already unwrapping the baby, checking for injuries, for frostbite, for any sign of harm, while Ethan stood at the window watching the bear. The animal hadn't moved from her spot on the porch, sitting there in the snow like a guardian, like a sentinel. The baby had stopped crying once it was warm, and Lily discovered it was a girl, perhaps 4 or 5 months old, with dark hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with unusual alertness. There was something else, too, tucked into the wrappings. A small wooden carving of a bear, intricately detailed and worn smooth, as if it had been handled many times. The bear stayed on the porch all night. Ethan checked every hour, and she was always there, sometimes standing, sometimes lying down, but always watching the door. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight painted the white world in shades of gold and pink. Lily had fashioned a makeshift crib from a large basket and some blankets, and the baby was sleeping peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to fill the cabin with a new kind of life. They had given her some warmed formula they had left over from when their niece had visited months ago, and she had taken it eagerly, her small hands gripping the bottle with surprising strength. The question of what to do hung in the air between them. Unspoken, but pressing. They should call the authorities, report an abandoned child. But how could they explain the bear? Who would believe them? And more importantly, something about the way the bear had brought the child to them, the deliberate nature of it, the trust implicit in the act, made them hesitate. This wasn't a simple case of abandonment. This was something else. Something that defied explanation but felt somehow sacred, somehow important. Ethan finally voiced what they were both thinking, that maybe they should wait, see what happened, give it a day or two before making any decisions. As if she had heard their conversation, the bear stood up and moved to the edge of the porch, looking back at the cabin one more time before lumbering off into the forest. But she didn't go far. Ethan could see her dark shape among the trees, maybe 50 yards away, still watching, still waiting. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. The bear would appear at the edge of the forest every morning and evening, never coming closer than that first night, but always there, always watching. Lily and Ethan found themselves adjusting their routine around these appearances, making sure the baby was visible through the window during these times, holding her up so the bear could see she was safe. She was cared for. The baby herself was thriving. She rarely cried, seemed content to observe the world around her with those bright eyes, and had an unusual fascination with the wooden bear carving. She would grip it in her tiny fist for hours, bringing it to her mouth, turning it over and over, as if it held some secret she was trying to understand. Lily had named her temporarily, calling her Hope, because that's what she felt when she looked at her, hope for something, though she couldn't quite say what. Ethan had gone through every missing child report he could find online, but there was nothing that matched. No Amber Alerts, no desperate parents looking for their baby. It was as if the child had appeared from nowhere, brought by a bear from the winter forest like something out of a fairy tale. The wooden carving became a source of endless speculation between them. It was old, that much was clear, the wood darkened with age and handling. The detail was extraordinary, every line of fur carefully carved, the bear's expression somehow both fierce and gentle. On the bottom, barely visible, were initials. S.R. They meant nothing to Ethan or Lily, but they suggested a story, a history that connected this child to something larger than just abandonment. The bear's continued presence reinforced this feeling. This wasn't random. This was purposeful, planned, though by whom and why remained a mystery that seemed to deepen with each passing day. A week passed, then 2, and still the bear maintained her vigil. The weather warmed slightly, the snow beginning to melt in places, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. Hope was growing, becoming more active, more engaged with the world around her. She would laugh when Lily sang to her, a bright, bubbling sound that filled the cabin with joy. She would reach for Ethan's beard when he held her, tugging on it with surprising strength. But always, always, she kept that wooden bear close, as if it was her connection to something important, something she couldn't afford to lose. The isolation that Ethan and Lily had chosen for themselves, that had once felt like freedom, now felt different. Not confining exactly, but charged with responsibility. They were guardians now, not just of this mysterious child, but of something larger, some trust that had been placed in them by a wild creature for reasons they couldn't fathom. They found themselves talking in whispers even when Hope was sleeping, as if the very walls of the cabin were listening, as if they were part of something sacred that demanded reverence. The bear's presence had changed everything, had turned their simple life into something extraordinary and slightly frightening. It was Lily who first suggested that maybe the bear knew something they didn't, that maybe there was danger somewhere out there that had driven her to this desperate act. The thought sent a chill through both of them, made them check the locks more carefully at night, made them watch the forest with new eyes. But days passed and nothing happened. No strangers appeared. No search parties came through. Just the bear, patient and watchful, and the baby who grew more beautiful and alert with each passing day. The mystery deepened rather than resolved, layers adding upon layers like the snow that continued to fall intermittently, covering tracks, hiding secrets. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting the snow-covered world in shades of orange and purple, something different happened. The bear appeared as usual at the forest's edge, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her, small and uncertain, was a cub. It couldn't have been more than a few months old itself, roughly the same age as Hope. The mother bear sat down, and the cub tumbled around her, playing in the snow, occasionally looking toward the cabin with curious eyes. Lily and Ethan watched from the window, Hope in Lily's arms, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like they were looking at a mirror of sorts. 2 mothers, 2 babies, separated by species but connected by something deeper, something primal and beautiful. The next morning brought another surprise. When Ethan went out to get firewood, he found something on the porch. It was a rabbit, freshly caught, carefully placed on the top step. The bear's tracks were clear in the snow, leading to and from the forest. It was an offering, a gift, and somehow Ethan knew it was also a thank you. The bear was providing for them as they were providing for Hope. It was an exchange, a relationship that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. He brought the rabbit inside, and though neither he nor Lily were hunters, they prepared it, feeling it would be disrespectful not to accept the gift. As the days turned into weeks, more gifts appeared. Sometimes a rabbit, sometimes a fish, once a collection of winter berries that should have been impossible to find. Each gift was placed carefully on the porch, and each time the bear would watch from the forest edge until someone came out to retrieve it. Hope seemed to sense when the bear was near, becoming more alert, more active, sometimes making soft cooing sounds that seemed directed at the window. The connection between them all was growing stronger, more complex, defying any rational explanation but feeling absolutely real and necessary. The wooden bear carving revealed another secret one evening when Hope was particularly fussy. She had been crying for an hour, unusual for her, and nothing Lily or Ethan did seemed to help. In desperation, Lily grabbed the carving, thinking to distract her with it, and as she did, she noticed something she hadn't before. The bear's belly was slightly raised, and when she pressed on it, there was a click. The carving split open, revealing a hollow interior, and inside was a small piece of paper, yellow with age. With shaking hands, she unfolded it, and found a message written in fading ink. "If something happens to me, please care for her. She is loved beyond measure. The forest knows her, and she knows the forest. Let her grow wild and free, but safe. S.R." The message changed everything and nothing all at once. It confirmed that Hope's arrival wasn't random, that someone had planned for this possibility, had trusted the bear to make this choice. But it raised more questions than it answered. Who was S.R.? What had happened to them? Why did they trust a wild bear with their child? And what did it mean that the forest knew her? Ethan and Lily sat up late into the night, discussing possibilities, theories, each more fantastical than the last. But in the end, they came back to the same conclusion. They had been chosen for this somehow, and they would honor that choice. The bear's cub began appearing more frequently, sometimes venturing closer to the cabin while its mother watched. Hope would press her face against the window when she saw it, making excited sounds, reaching out with her small hands as if she wanted to play. There was a recognition there, a connection that seemed to go deeper than mere curiosity. Sometimes, late at night, Ethan would swear he could hear the bears moving around outside, not threatening but protective, like guardians keeping watch. The forest itself seemed to have accepted them as a part of its extended family, birds landing unusually close, deer passing by the windows without fear. 3 months had passed since that snowy night when the bear had knocked on their door. Hope had grown considerably, starting to sit up on her own, babbling in a way that sometimes sounded almost like she was trying to communicate with the animals she saw through the window. The wooden bear carving never left her side, and she had developed a habit of holding it up to the window when the real bears appeared, as if showing them that she still had it, that she remembered. The message in the carving had become a sort of guide for them, especially the part about letting her grow wild and free. They took her outside daily now, bundled against the cold, letting her feel the wind, hear the forest sounds, touch the snow. It was during one of these outdoor excursions that they met him. An older man, weathered and worn, wearing the uniform of a park ranger, though Ethan knew the nearest park station was 20 miles away. He emerged from the forest path they rarely used, moving slowly, carefully, as if he didn't want to startle them. The bears were visible at the forest edge, watching, but they didn't seem alarmed by his presence. If anything, they seemed to recognize him. He introduced himself as Jacob Bennett, said he'd been a ranger in these parts for 40 years, and that he'd heard rumors of something unusual happening at the old Marshall cabin. Jacob's eyes went immediately to Hope, to the wooden carving in her hand, and something shifted in his weathered face. Recognition, sadness, and something else, something like relief. He asked if they could talk, said he might have some answers to questions he was sure they had. Lily invited him in, made coffee, and they sat around the kitchen table while Hope played in her makeshift playpen, the wooden bear clutched as always in her tiny fist. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if gathering his thoughts, or maybe his courage. He began to speak, his voice rough with emotion, about a woman he'd known years ago, a woman named Savannah Reed. She'd lived deeper in the forest, in a cabin that was more like a shelter, choosing a life of complete isolation after some tragedy he never fully understood. But she hadn't been entirely alone. She'd formed a bond with a female bear, a bond that had started when she'd saved the bear as a cub from a trap. The bear would visit her daily, would even bring her food sometimes, and Savannah would talk to her like she was human, tell her stories, share her loneliness. It had been beautiful and strange and somehow perfect for these woods where the line between wild and civilized had always been blurry. Savannah had gotten pregnant, Jacob continued, the father someone from her past who'd visited once and never returned. She'd been determined to raise the child in the forest, to teach it the ways of the wild alongside the ways of humans. She'd carved that wooden bear while pregnant, told Jacob once that it was a promise, a token of the bond between her child and the forest. But something had gone wrong during the birth. Jacob had found her too late, had tried to get her to a hospital, but she'd died on the way. The baby had survived, had been taken by social services, placed with relatives, he thought. That had been 5 years ago. He'd always wondered what had happened to the child. The room was silent except for Hope's soft babbling and the crackle of the fire. Lily finally asked the question they were all thinking. If Hope had been placed with relatives 5 years ago, she would be 5 years old now. Not 5 months. Jacob nodded slowly, said he'd thought the same thing, but then he'd learned something recently. Savannah had a sister, a twin sister actually, named Sarah. Sarah had visited Savannah once, heavily pregnant herself, just a few months before Savannah died. The sisters had been estranged for years, but pregnancy had brought them back together, if only briefly. Sarah had been sick, some kind of cancer, and she'd been worried about what would happen to her baby if she died. The pieces were falling into place now, painting a picture that was both tragic and beautiful. Sarah must have remembered her sister's stories about the bear, must have known somehow that if something happened to her, the bear would remember the promise. Would know what to do. The wooden carving would have been passed from Savannah to Sarah, a token of that promise, a key to a safety net that existed outside the normal human world. And when Sarah had died, because she must have died for this to have happened, someone, maybe a hospice worker, maybe a friend, had brought the baby to the forest, to the bear, trusting in a story that sounded impossible but was absolutely true. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, worn and creased from being carried. It showed 2 women, identical in features but different in bearing. One wore city clothes and smiled at the camera with practiced ease. The other looked uncomfortable being photographed, wore rough outdoor clothing, and had her arm around a massive brown bear. Savannah and Sarah Reed. Sisters who had chosen different paths but were bound by blood and, apparently, by an understanding that transcended death. The bear in the photograph was younger, but unmistakably the same one that kept vigil at the forest edge. Hope had pulled herself up to standing using the edge of her playpen, the wooden bear still in one hand, reaching with the other toward the photograph. Her blue eyes, so alert and knowing for a baby, seemed to recognize something in it. Jacob smiled sadly and said that both sisters had those same eyes, that same way of looking at the world like they could see through to its heart. He stood to leave, said he'd keep their secret if they wanted him to, that as far as he was concerned, the forest had made its choice, and who was he to argue with it? Before he left, Jacob mentioned one more thing. The bear, he said, was named Mika by Savannah. It meant new moon, in some language Savannah had studied, She'd chosen the name because she'd found the cub on a night with no moon, in complete darkness, guided only by its cries. It seemed fitting somehow that Mika had brought hope to them on another dark night, completing a circle that had begun years ago with an act of compassion between a woman and a wild animal. He tipped his hat and walked back into the forest, leaving them with more answers but also with a deeper sense of the responsibility they'd taken on. That night, after Hope was asleep, Ethan and Lily stood at the window watching Mika and her cub at the forest edge. The moon was rising, almost full, casting silver light across the snow. They talked about what Jacob had told them, about the sisters and the promise and the strange, beautiful trust that had brought hope to their door. They talked about the future, about raising a child who belonged to both the civilized world and the wild one, about honoring both parts of her heritage. They talked about love that transcended species, about connections that defied logic but felt absolutely true. As they watched, Mika stood and moved closer to the cabin than she had in weeks, stopping just at the edge of the porch light's reach. She stood on her hind legs, massive and magnificent in the moonlight, and for just a moment she looked exactly like a human parent checking on their child one last time before bed. Then she dropped back to all fours and ambled back to the forest, her cub tumbling after her. The message was clear. She trusted them completely now. The vigil would continue, but it had transformed from watchful concern to partnership. The next morning brought a change in the weather, a warming that suggested spring might finally be approaching. Hope woke with the sunrise, babbling happily in her crib, reaching for the wooden bear that had fallen just out of reach during the night. Lily picked her up, and together they went to the window to look for Mika. She was there, as always, but this time she was teaching her cub something, showing it how to dig through the snow to find the plants beneath. It was a lesson in survival, in the knowledge that would keep it alive in the wild world. Watching them, Lily realized that she and Ethan would need to do the same for Hope. Teach her not just how to survive in the human world, but how to respect and understand the wild one that was also her birthright. It wouldn't be easy, raising a child with one foot in each world, but looking at Hope's face, at the joy and recognition in her eyes as she watched the bears, Lily knew it was right. This was where Hope belonged, here at the boundary between worlds, bridging them with her very existence. The wooden bear carving seemed to pulse with warmth in Hope's hand, a tangible reminder of the love and trust that had brought them all together. Ethan joined them at the window, his arm around Lily, his other hand gently touching Hope's head. They were a family now, unconventional and unexpected, but bound by something stronger than blood or law. They were bound by the trust of a wild creature, by the love of sisters who had found a way to protect a child even beyond death, by the forest itself that had accepted them as its own. As the sun climbed higher, painting the world in shades of gold and green where the snow was melting, Mika and her cub disappeared back into the forest. But they would return, Ethan and Lily knew, as surely as the sun would set and rise again. They were part of the pattern now, part of the rhythm of this place where the impossible became possible, where bears knocked on doors and left babies on porches, where love transcended every boundary humans tried to put on it. Hope cooed and reached for the window, and in her voice Lily could hear something wild and free, something that belonged to both the cabin and the forest, to both the human world and the one that existed beyond it. The story of how Hope came to them would be one they could never fully tell to others, would never be believed if they tried. But here, in this cabin at the edge of the wilderness, it didn't need to be told. It was lived every day in the exchange of glances between human and bear, in the gifts left on the porch, in the way Hope's eyes lit up when she heard Mika's distinctive call from the forest. It was a story written in trust and love, in the understanding that family can take many forms, and that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that can't be explained, only felt. Days passed in this new rhythm, each one bringing small revelations and deepening bonds. Hope began to crawl, always toward the windows where she could see the forest. Her first real laugh came when Mika's cub performed a particularly spectacular tumble in the snow, and the sound of it seemed to carry all the way to where Mika sat, causing the great bear's ears to perk up. Ethan started leaving small offerings of his own on the porch, vegetables from their root cellar, pieces of homemade bread, creating an exchange that felt ancient and sacred. The wooden bear carving revealed one more secret when Hope, in a moment of unusual fussiness, bit down on it hard enough to crack a small section. Inside the crack was a tiny braid of hair, 2 colors twisted together, one dark like Savannah's in the photograph, one lighter like Sarah's. It was a physical binding of the sisters, a token of their connection that now passed to Hope. Lily carefully sealed the crack with a bit of beeswax, preserving the treasure within, understanding that this carving was more than just a toy or even a token. It was a talisman, a physical manifestation of the love and protection that surrounded Hope from both the human and wild worlds. Spring arrived in earnest, melting the snow and revealing a world of green beneath. Micah and her cub expanded their range, but always returned to check on the cabin, on Hope. Other animals began to appear too, deer that would graze unusually close to the windows, birds that would perch on the porch railing and sing directly to Hope when she was outside. It was as if the forest had marked her as one of its own, extending its protection and interest to this small human child who carried its secrets in her blood and bone. Jacob visited again, bringing supplies and stories. He told them about Savannah's life in the forest, how she'd known every plant and animal, how she delivered Mika's cub when the bear had struggled with the birth, cementing a bond that went beyond mere friendship. He told them about Sarah's visits, how she'd been a successful lawyer in the city but had always seemed lost, searching for something she couldn't name. Perhaps, he mused, she'd found it in the end, in trusting her child to the same wild protection her sister had cultivated. The legal questions lingered in the background, unaddressed but present. Hope had no birth certificate that they knew of, no social security number, no official existence. But Jacob, with his decades of experience and connections, suggested that sometimes, in places like this, the official world could be made to accommodate the real one. He knew people, he said, people who understood that not everything important could be documented, that sometimes a child could appear like a gift from the forest and be no less real, no less deserving of a life and a future. One evening, as summer approached and the days grew longer, something extraordinary happened. Mika approached the cabin closer than ever before, coming right up to the porch where Ethan and Lily sat with Hope. The massive bear sat down just feet away, her eyes meeting theirs with an intelligence that took their breath away. Hope, in Lily's arms, reached out toward Mika, babbling excitedly, and then, in a moment that would be burned into their memories forever, Mika leaned forward and very gently, with infinite care, touched her nose to Hope's outstretched hand. The contact lasted only a second, but in that second, something passed between them, some understanding or promise or blessing. Hope giggled, a sound of pure joy, and Mika made a soft rumbling sound that might have been laughter too. Then the bear stood and walked away, but the distance between them had been forever changed. They were connected now in a way that went beyond watching and waiting. They were family, strange and impossible, and absolutely true. That night, Lily found herself writing in a journal she'd started keeping, trying to document this incredible journey. She wrote about the trust that had been placed in them, about the responsibility of raising a child who belonged to two worlds. She wrote about love that transcended species and death, about connections that defied explanation. She wrote about Mika and her cub, about Jacob and his stories, about the wooden bear that was never far from Hope's grasp. But mostly, she wrote about Hope herself, this remarkable child who had come to them through the most unlikely of channels, who seemed to carry within her the wisdom of the forest and the potential of humanity. The summer had transformed the landscape around the cabin into a paradise of green and gold, with wildflowers blooming in meadows that had been buried under snow just months before. Hope was now crawling everywhere, pulling herself up on furniture and saying her first words, though whether ba-ba meant bear or bottle remained a delightful mystery. It was on one of these perfect summer mornings that Jacob Bennet returned, but this time his weathered face carried a different expression, one of discovery rather than simple friendship. He had been researching, he said, digging through old records and forgotten files, and he had found something that Ethan and Lily needed to know. He spread old documents on their kitchen table, yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes that told a fuller story of the Reed sisters. Savannah had been a wildlife biologist before she retreated to the forest, had published papers on interspecies communication and animal intelligence that had been considered too radical by her peers. She had come to these woods not to escape, but to prove her theories, to live them rather than just write about them. The bond with Mika hadn't been accidental but part of a larger experiment in trust and communication between species. Sarah, the lawyer's sister, had initially thought Savannah was crazy, but something had changed her mind during that final visit while pregnant. Among the papers was a letter, sealed but addressed to whoever cares for my child. Jacob had debated whether to open it, but felt it belonged to them now, to the people who had answered the call. Lily's hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter, written in a careful, flowing script. It was from Sarah, and it was dated just 2 weeks before Hope had appeared on their doorstep. She had been in hospice care, knowing her time was running out, and she had made arrangements that seemed insane to everyone except the one person who had believed her. A hospice worker named Margaret, who had grown up in these mountains and knew that sometimes the old stories were true. Sarah wrote about visiting Savannah that final time, heavily pregnant and already sick, though she didn't know it yet. She wrote about watching her sister interact with Mika, seeing a communication that went beyond training or conditioning, that spoke to something deeper and older than modern science could explain. Savannah had told her that if anything ever happened, Mika would know, would help, would remember the promise made between species. Sarah had thought it was beautiful but impossible until the day Savannah died, and Mika had appeared at the ranger station, had led Jacob to Savannah's body, had shown an understanding of death and loss that had shaken everyone who witnessed it. The letter went on to explain that when Sarah learned her cancer was terminal, when she realized her daughter would be alone in the world, she remembered Savannah's words. The father was gone, had been gone since before he knew about the pregnancy, and Sarah had no other family except the memory of a sister who had trusted a bear with her life. So she had made a plan that sounded like madness but felt like truth. She had asked Margaret to take her daughter to the old-growth forest, to the place where Savannah's cabin had stood, to leave her with the wooden bear carving and trust that Mika would remember, would know what to do. But there was more in the letter, something that made Lily gasp and reach for Ethan's hand. Sarah had legally prepared for this possibility. There were documents filed with a law firm in the city that would activate if someone came forward having found a baby with a wooden bear carving. The documents would establish a legal adoption, would create a paper trail that made everything legitimate, would ensure that Hope could have a normal life while maintaining her extraordinary origin, Sarah had thought of everything, had used her legal expertise to create a framework for the impossible, to give legal standing to an act of faith. Jacob had already contacted the law firm, had set things in motion. Within weeks, Ethan and Lily would legally be Hope's parents, with all the documentation necessary for her to exist in the modern world while living at the edge of the Wild One. It was a gift beyond measure, a final act of love from a mother who had trusted in something greater than human systems, who had believed that love and connection could transcend not just death but species itself. The letter ended with a simple request. Let her know both worlds, let her be the bridge her aunt dreamed of, let her prove that the boundaries we draw are not as solid as we think. That afternoon, while Hope napped, Lily and Ethan walked to the spot where Savannah's cabin had stood. Jacob had shown them the location on an old map, and they found it easily enough, a small clearing where the foundation stones still remained, being slowly reclaimed by moss and ferns. Mika was there, as if she had known they would come, sitting in what must have been the main room of the cabin, her cub playing among the ruins. She looked at them with those knowing eyes, and Ethan could swear he saw memory there, saw the ghost of another woman, another time, another extraordinary friendship. They began visiting the ruins regularly, bringing Hope when she woke from her naps. She seemed to recognize the place somehow, would become calm and focused there in a way she didn't anywhere else. Mika would often meet them there, and as Hope grew steadier on her feet, taking her first wobbling steps, the bear cub would mirror her movements, the two youngsters learning to navigate the world in parallel. It was during one of these visits that Hope said her first clear word, pointing at Micah and declaring, "Mama," which made Lily laugh and cry at the same time, understanding that for Hope, mother was a concept that included more than just the woman who fed and bathed her. The legal papers came through faster than expected, and suddenly Hope was officially Hope Marshall Morgan, their daughter in the eyes of the law, as she had been in their hearts since that snowy night. With the papers came a package from Sarah's estate, photographs and journals that told the story of two sisters who had chosen different paths but had never stopped loving each other. There were pictures of them as children, identical and inseparable. Pictures of them as young women, growing apart but still connected, and one final picture of them together, both pregnant, standing in front of Savannah's cabin with Mika visible in the background. A moment of reconciliation and promise. Sarah's journals revealed her struggle with leaving the conventional world behind, her envy of Savannah's courage to live according to her beliefs, and finally, her acceptance that her daughter might be the one to unite both worlds. She wrote about the wooden bear, how Savannah had carved it while telling her about the old legends of these mountains, about bears that were more than bears, about the thin places where the wild and the civilized could meet and merge. She wrote about feeling her daughter move inside her while watching Mika and Savannah interact, feeling like the baby was responding to something beyond normal human perception. As autumn approached, painting the forest in shades of fire, Hope took her first independent steps not in the cabin but in the ruins of Savannah's old home, walking from Lily's arms to where Micah sat, placing her small hand on the bear's massive paw with absolute trust. Micah remained perfectly still, allowing the contact, and her cub came over to investigate, the three youngsters creating a tableau that seemed to collapse time, to suggest that this moment had always been destined to happen. Jacob, who had come to witness this meeting, said quietly that Savannah would have cried to see it, would have felt vindicated in every choice she'd made. The story of Hope's arrival had spread quietly through the mountain community, not as gossip but as something closer to legend. People would occasionally leave gifts on Ethan and Lily's porch, hand-knitted blankets for Hope, preserved foods for the family, always with a note that said something like, "For the forest child," or "For the bridge builder." The local doctor, an old woman who had delivered babies in these mountains for 50 years, came to check on Hope and declared her the healthiest child she'd ever seen, with a note in her voice that suggested she knew this child was different, special, chosen. Hope's development continued to astound everyone who met her. By 18 months, she was not just walking but climbing, her coordination and strength unusual for her age. She seemed to understand the moods of animals before they were expressed, would know when Mika was approaching long before she was visible, would calm crying birds and nervous rabbits with a touch. But she was also intensely human, loving books and music, learning words at an extraordinary rate, showing empathy and humor that delighted everyone around her. She was, as Sarah had hoped, a bridge between worlds, comfortable in both, limited by neither. The wooden bear carving remained her constant companion, but now it was joined by other treasures. Feathers that birds left on the porch, interesting stones that Mika's cub would push toward her, flowers that Ethan and Lily would help her pick and press. Her room became a museum of the natural world, but also filled with the normal toys and books of childhood. She would play tea party with stuffed animals and then go outside to share her snacks with very real squirrels and chipmunks who seemed to have no fear of her whatsoever. One day, as the first snow of Hope's second winter began to fall, Mika brought something new to the cabin. It was another carving, rough and obviously recently made, showing 2 bears and a human child standing together. The knife marks were fresh, the wood still green, and Ethan and Lily realized with shock that someone else was out there, someone who knew the story, who was adding to it. Jacob, when consulted, had no answers, but suggested that these mountains held many secrets, many people who had chosen to live beyond the reach of the modern world, and perhaps one of them was acknowledging Hope's place in the larger story of these woods. Winter settled over the mountains again, but this time it felt different. Instead of isolation, the cabin felt like the warm heart of a larger community that included not just the human neighbors they rarely saw, but the animals that were constant presences in their lives. Hope would stand at the window and narrate the activities of the creatures outside, creating elaborate stories about their adventures and relationships. Her favorite times were when Mika and her cub would come close enough for her to see clearly, and she would press her hand against the glass while the cub did the same from the other side, 2 youngsters separated by glass but connected by something much stronger. The mystery of the new carving was solved when a figure emerged from the forest one snowy afternoon, moving slowly and carefully like someone who had lived in the wild for so long that they had adopted its rhythms. It was a woman, old and bent, but with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and humor. She introduced herself simply as Marie, said she had known Savannah well, had learned from her, had been living deeper in the forest for 20 years. She had been watching, she said, waiting to see if the experiment would continue, if the bridge Savannah had tried to build would hold. Seeing Hope, seeing the relationship with Mika, she knew it had not just held, but grown stronger. Marie became an occasional visitor, always arriving unannounced, always bringing some gift of knowledge about the forest or about Savannah's work. She taught Hope to identify plants before she could properly pronounce their names, showed her how to move through the forest without disturbing it, how to read the signs that animals left behind. But more importantly, she provided a living link to Savannah, sharing stories that helped Ethan and Lily understand the depth of the legacy Hope had inherited. Savannah hadn't just been living with the bears. She had been documenting a new way of understanding the relationship between humans and the wild, work that Marie had preserved and continued. The journals Marie shared were revelations, filled with observations about animal behavior that challenged conventional wisdom, about communication that transcended vocalization, about the possibility of genuine emotional bonds between species. But they also contained Savannah's doubts and fears, her worry that she was anthropomorphizing, that she was seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was really there. It was only when Mika had saved her from a fall, had actively chosen to help her when she could have simply walked away, that Savannah had truly believed in the reality of their connection. As spring returned once more, Hope began to speak in full sentences, and her first complete statement was remarkable. Mika is sad today. Her cub is growing up. And indeed, when they looked outside, Mika's cub, now nearly as large as its mother, was standing apart, showing the first signs of the independence that would eventually lead it to its own territory. Hope's ability to read the emotional states of the animals around her was uncanny, but felt entirely natural to everyone who knew her story. She was what Savannah had theorized was possible, a human who could truly communicate with the wild world, not through domination or training, but through genuine understanding and empathy. The legal documents that Sarah had prepared contained one more surprise that only became relevant as Hope approached her 3rd birthday. There was a trust fund, modest but sufficient, specifically designated for Hope's education, with the stipulation that it include both traditional schooling and what Sarah had called forest learning. There were letters of introduction to professors at various universities who had known Savannah, who had taken her work seriously, who would ensure that Hope's unique perspective would be valued rather than dismissed. Sarah had thought of everything, had created a path for Hope that honored both sides of her heritage. But for now, Hope was just a child, playing in the sunshine, chasing butterflies, and calling out greetings to every creature she saw. Her favorite game was to sit very still and see how many animals would approach her, and the record was astounding. Birds would land on her shoulders, squirrels would eat from her hands, and once, memorably, a young deer had lain down beside her and fallen asleep. Ethan and Lily had learned to always have a camera ready, not because anyone else would believe these moments, but because they wanted Hope to have proof of her extraordinary childhood when she was older. The relationship with Mika evolved as Hope grew. The bear still came daily, but now often brought other bears with her, introducing Hope to the larger community of the forest. It was as if Mika was teaching Hope about bear society, just as Ethan and Lily were teaching her about human society. The wooden bear carving, now worn smooth from constant handling, seemed to pulse with warmth during these meetings, as if it recognized its kin, as if it was part of the communication network that connected Hope to the wild world. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Hope play with a collection of stones she insisted were a bear family, Jacob brought news from the outside world. There was interest in Savannah's work. Scientists who wanted to study the relationship between Hope and the bears, documentary makers who had heard rumors of the bear child of the mountains. Ethan and Lily's immediate instinct was to protect Hope from this attention, but Jacob suggested something else. Perhaps, when she was older, when she could make her own choices, Hope might want to share her gift with the world, might want to continue Savannah's work in proving that the boundaries between human and animal were not as fixed as people believed. For now, though, they would keep her safe, would let her grow in this magical space between worlds. The decision felt right, felt like what both Savannah and Sarah would have wanted. Hope needed time to understand her gift, to grow into it, to become strong enough to handle the skepticism and wonder she would eventually face. She needed these years of pure connection, of unquestioned belonging to both the cabin and the forest, the human world and the wild one. As Hope's 3rd birthday approached, they planned a celebration that reflected her unique life. There would be a cake in the cabin with the few human friends who had become part of their extended family, but there would also be offerings left at the ruins of Savannah's cabin, a celebration that included Mika and the other creatures who were just as much Hope's family. It felt right, this dual celebration, this acknowledgement that Hope belonged fully to neither world and completely to both. The day before her birthday, Hope did something that took everyone's breath away. She walked up to Mika, who was sitting at the forest edge, and hugged her. Not a tentative touch or a careful pat, but a full embrace, her small arms wrapping as far as they could around the massive bear's neck. Mika remained perfectly still for a moment. Then, very gently, with a care that seemed impossible for such a powerful creature, she placed one paw on Hope's back, returning the embrace. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, the promise made years ago between a dying woman and a wild bear was completely fulfilled. That night, Lily wrote in her journal about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She wrote about the knock on the door that had changed everything, about the trust that had been placed in them, about the love that had grown to encompass not just Hope, but the entire extended family of the forest. She wrote about Savannah and Sarah, two sisters whose love had transcended death to create something extraordinary. She wrote about Micah, the bear who had shown them that consciousness and love were not exclusively human traits. But mostly, she wrote about Hope, the child who was proving every day that the world was far more connected, far more magical than most people ever realized. The morning of Hope's third birthday dawned clear and bright, with birds singing what seemed like a celebration song. Hope woke early, as she always did, and ran to the window to greet Micah, who was waiting with what looked like her entire extended family. There were bears of all sizes, from cubs to elderly males who usually kept to themselves, all gathered at the forest edge as if they knew this was a special day. Hope laughed and waved, and the bears, in their way, seemed to wave back, lifting paws and nodding heads in what had become a familiar greeting ritual. The human celebration was small but perfect, with Jacob and Marie and the old doctor and a few other mountain folk who had become friends. They sang songs and told stories, and watched Hope play with a mix of traditional toys and natural treasures. But the real magic happened later, when they all walked to Savannah's ruins for the forest celebration. The bears were there, keeping a respectful distance but clearly present, clearly participating. Marie sang an old mountain song about the connection between all living things, and Hope danced, spinning and laughing, the wooden bear carving held high above her head. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, something extraordinary happened. A butterfly, late in the season and seemingly lost, landed on Hope's outstretched hand. She stood perfectly still, and one by one, other creatures emerged from the forest. Birds, rabbits, a fox, even a family of raccoons, all gathering in the clearing as if called by some silent signal. They didn't interact with each other. Predator and prey, standing peacefully side by side, all focused on the small girl in the center who seemed to radiate a peace that transcended natural law. Marie whispered that she had seen this once before, with Savannah, on the day she had first saved Mika as a cub. It was what she called a gathering of grace, a moment when the forest recognized someone as a true bridge, someone who belonged to all worlds and none, someone who could speak the universal language of connection that existed before humans forgot how to listen. It lasted only minutes, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something sacred, something that proved Savannah's theories and validated Sarah's desperate act of faith. As the animals dispersed and they walked back to the cabin in the gathering darkness, Hope riding on Ethan's shoulders, the wooden bear clutched in one hand and a feather gifted by a crow in the other, Lily felt a profound sense of completion. not ending, but completion of a circle that had begun with two sisters who saw the world differently but loved each other deeply. Hope was their legacy, but she was also her own beginning, a new chapter in the ancient story of humans and the wild. That night, after Hope was asleep, Ethan and Lily stood on the porch looking out at the darkness where they knew Mika kept watch. They talked about the future, about how they would help Hope navigate the two worlds she belonged to, about the challenges and wonders that lay ahead. They talked about the trust that had been placed in them, and how they had grown into it, how it had changed them. They were not the same people who had lived quietly in this cabin before that snowy night. They were part of something larger now, guardians of a bridge between worlds, parents to a child who might just prove that the separation between human and nature was an illusion we had created and could therefore dissolve. The story that had begun with a knock on the door had evolved into something neither of them could have imagined. It was a story of trust that transcended species, of love that survived death, of connections that defied logic but felt absolutely true. It was Hope's story, but it was also Mika's and Savannah's and Sarah's and theirs. It was a story that belonged to the forest and the cabin, to the wild and the civilized, to the ancient past and the uncertain future. As they prepared for bed, they checked on Hope one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, the wooden bear held close, a smile on her face as if her dreams were filled with wonders. Outside, they could hear Mika's distinctive breathing, the sound that had once frightened them but now comforted them, a reminder that they were never alone, that the forest itself was standing guard. They went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring new adventures, new moments of magic and challenge, but that whatever came, they would face it together. This unlikely family bound by trust and love and the belief that the world was far more connected than most people ever dared to imagine. The years that followed would bring their own stories, their own challenges and triumphs. Hope would grow and learn, would eventually go to school, where she would struggle to explain why she knew things about animals that weren't in any books, would make friends who would visit the cabin and leave believing in magic. She would study both biology and poetry, science and folklore, building bridges with her mind as naturally as she did with her heart. She would become what Savannah had dreamed of and Sarah had hoped for, living proof that the boundaries we draw are arbitrary, that love and consciousness and connection exist in forms we're only beginning to understand. But all of that was still to come. For now, there was just this: a cabin in the woods, a family that included bears and humans, a child who belonged to all worlds, and a wooden carving that held the memory and promise of it all. The impossible had become possible, the extraordinary had become ordinary, and in that transformation lay a truth that the forest had always known. That connection is the fundamental force of existence, and that love, in all its forms, is the bridge that makes all other bridges possible. The story of the bear who knocked on the door, of the baby left on the porch, of the family that formed across species boundaries would be told and retold in these mountains for generations. But for those who lived it, it wasn't a story at all. It was simply life, mysterious and beautiful, and perfectly natural. A reminder that the world is far more magical than we usually allow ourselves to believe, and that sometimes, if we're very lucky and very open, that magic knocks on our door and asks us to be part of something extraordinary.